American public perceptions of Israel seem to be shifting sharply. In 2022, before the October 7th attacks and the war that ensued, 42% of American adults held an unfavorable view of Israel. Today, just 4 years later, that number is up to 60%, according to recent Pew Research polls. And for Americans under the age of 50, that number is even higher. 70% of that population held an unfavorable view of Israel in 2026, up from around 50%, same group in 2022. Joining me now is the Israeli-American historian Omar Bartov. He is the Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He has a new book out, Israel, What Went Wrong. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So what I want to first focus on is the answer to your question, because for you, both personally and professionally in the book, you think that Israel took a wrong turn on two dimensions, or one of them is a historical one. Explain what it is, what did go wrong?
Right, so what interests me most is how Zionism, which was an ideology of liberation and emancipation for a Jewish minority, 80% of world Jewry, who lived in East Central Europe and came under increasing pressure from nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and eventually anti-Semitism and violence, a movement that said, well, let's define the Jewish people as well as a nation and find a place for them where there would be a majority and have a state of their own. How that movement, especially after 1948, becomes something else, becomes a state ideology that increasingly becomes militaristic, expansionist, violent, and in the last few years, racist, Jewish supremacist, and in Gaza also genocidal. How did that happen? And I try to, there are many answers to this, but I would say that the most important moment is what happens in 1948 itself with the establishment of the state, when Zionism changes from having these two faces, one of liberation from oppression and the other becoming a state ideology of occupation and oppression of others.
So a lot of people would push back and say that in a sense you do have it right, but what you want is the Jews to be permanent victims. That when you look at Jews with power, with a huge army, with a successful country that is, outperforming others, that you're deeply uncomfortable with that there is a certain strain of the Israeli left that just doesn't like a very powerful Israel.
I think, one could make that argument. That's not the way I look at it. What is so interesting in the case of Israel is that the more powerful it became, especially after the war of 1973, Israel became the hegemon in its region, became the most powerful country in the region, not least because of American support as well. And it's during that period that the Holocaust, that Israel was seen as the answer to after 1948, becomes not only something that you need to remember and commemorate and study and research, but also an imminent danger, that the country develops a self-perception of a society, a state that is under imminent danger. And that creates in Israel a sense that any danger to any threat, and most of the threats are coming from the people that it occupies, may lead to its destruction. And because of that, it begins giving it infinite license to respond with any kind of violence that it sees appropriate.
You also say that it's the Holocaust is one part of it, and then the occupation has changed Israel. Explain what you mean.
One has to remember that since 1967, when I was 13 years old, to now, when I'm 72, Israel has been an occupying power. Half of the population under Israeli control, and Israel is basically one state from the river to the sea. People living there under different regimes. half of the population, nowadays 7 million Jews, rule over 7 million Palestinians. That process of ruling over people for so long in such great proximity has done something that when I was a teenager and protesting against a very young occupation, we used to say occupation corrupts. We didn't quite know how much it would corrupt and how long it would last. It corrupts society. You dehumanize the people you occupy. You have to, because why are you occupying them? Why are you bossing over them? And that dehumanization of those you're ruling over begins a process of dehumanizing you as a society.
Next on GPS, Omar Bartov's critics say that he doesn't really consider the perspective of many Israelis, the Israeli narrative, if you will. I'll put that to him and see how he responds to it when we come back. And we are back with Israeli-American historian Omar Bartov. He is the Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown and has a new book out, Israel, What Went Wrong. What I would wonder is, when I talk about you and your work to Jewish friends of mine, they will often say he doesn't really take into account the Israeli narrative of what happened. The Israeli narrative, I would say, is that yes, the occupation has been very difficult, but Israel has repeatedly tried to negotiate for some end to the occupation, that the places that they are fighting in are places from which emanate attacks all the time. So there are rockets being fired at them from Lebanon. There were rockets being fired at them from Gaza. There was October 7th. That this is all, that this is a society under a certain amount of siege, surrounded by countries that want to kill it. And yeah, maybe it's being very tough, but it's being very tough in a tough neighborhood. And again, you're more comfortable with Israel as the pitiful victim, not as the tough guy who's doing what the strong often do.
Let's start with the neighborhood. Israel's neighborhood has wanted to have peace with it for a long time. Israel has peace with Egypt. It has peace with Jordan. Saudi Arabia proposed peace with Israel 20 years ago. So it isn't that Israel is actually in a neighborhood that wants to destroy it. It's in a neighborhood that wants to work with it, not for love of the Jews, but because Israel is a strong country and has a very, very strong ally that all those other Sunni Arab countries would like to work with. So that's one myth that is propagated by many Israel defenders. As for the relationship with Palestinians, the last serious attempt to bring about a settlement with the Palestinians was under Yitzhak Rabin. It was partial. These are the Oslo Accords of the early 1990s. It was partial. Israel never agreed to go back to the issue of 1948. It said, we'll begin in 1967, we have to resolve the issue of the occupation. Rabin understood that the occupation was corrupting Israeli society, and he accepted that. What was on offer was partial, was not the best solution, but at least there was negotiation.
There were two other prime ministers who made offers.
Yes. What Ehud Barak tried to do was to say to the Palestinians, here is what you can have. Take it or leave it. Again, he would not talk about the core issue that is at the basis of Israeli-Palestinian relations. We have to remember, during the war of 1948, most of the Palestinians living in what became the State of Israel, 750,000, were kicked out, were expelled, often very violently. There were many cases of massacres, far more documented now than were in the past. That is the core issue. How does Israel come to terms with the way that it was created in a way that would make it possible for Jews and Palestinians who are equal numbers living between the river and the sea to share that space?
Let me ask you about the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly in the West. It does feel like, it's one thing to protest the Israeli government, but then why are you going to a synagogue? The attacks on synagogues, on community centers, are often seem to...
I would never defend any of those attacks on Jews, There have been attacks on Jews, sometimes by anti-Semitic white supremacists, and sometimes by people who trace themselves to Arab or Palestinian or Muslim descent, as we saw in Australia and other places. You can never defend that. That's criminal. What I'm saying is that the actions that Israel has taken, and the fact that Israel has claimed to be the representative of Jews around the world, while it is exercising so much violence against Palestinians, has actually played into that narrative. That is, that people associate Jews with the actions of Israel. Israel has acted as a trigger to the rise of actual anti-Semitism.
I assume you've lost a lot of friends in Israel over your writing and speaking.
Look, I mean, I don't know. When you lose friends, they don't necessarily tell you that you lost them. I know of some cases. I think many of the people I know in Israel, they're mostly left of center. They are reluctant to talk about this. And that's what has troubled me most. Yes, I don't want to lose my friends. These are friends of 50, 55 years. But what has troubled me most is that apart from the Israeli right, which is bloody-minded and violent, the majority of the Israeli population is living in denial, has become indifferent to what was carried out in its name by its own people, often children of people my age, who were in Gaza as regular soldiers, as reservists, and people don't want to talk about it. They would like to wake up one morning and just to hear that the Palestinians have gone. That is deeply troubling to me about the society that I grew up in.
Omar Barto, thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.